last week was last week was fairly dense because I really wanted to get across the point that the whole foundation for the modern theology of marriage is based on a reading of Genesis, which is very naive, very literalistic, and actually doesn't follow the guidelines for interpretation laid down in the Second Vatican Council document, Dei Verbum. So I wanted to just show you by going to some issues of translation that when we hear appeals to Genesis to underwrite the modern understanding of sexuality and marriage, we really are in a rather uncritical and romanticized realm of biblical interpretation. And I also spoke a little about natural law because those are the two sources upon which the theology of marriage is based, as well as the sacramental significance of nuptial ecclesiology of the Church as the bride of Christ. Tonight, I'm doing a much more informal kind of ramble through some of the ways in which these now play into the contemporary church. And I hope to allow for time for some small group discussions and then some open time for questions and discussions later. So during the last century, I think we all know that the Catholic understanding of marriage has undergone a transformation, which may be partly cosmetic, but which I think also brings to the foreground aspects of love, relationality, sexuality, which have previously been very much sublimated to the procreative function of marriage. So, as I mentioned last week, the doctrine of marriage in the church has always been based upon St. Augustine's idea of the three goods of marriage: procreation, fidelity and companionship, and sacramentality. I mean, St. Augustine did qualify that because he thought that if God had only wanted to create a companion for Adam, surely God would have created another man. So the fact that God created a woman suggests that the friendship aspect of marriage shouldn't be exaggerated. So procreation, fidelity, and sacramentality. And as we all know, until recently, that unitive dimension of married love was subjugated to its procreative function. And I'm referring to the American Catholic theological ethicist Michael Lawler, who suggests that in terms of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, a man and a woman who hated one another could marry for the sake of procreation. Of course, canon law doesn't say that, but as late as 1958, a canon law decision stated that consummation can be had independently of consciousness and free consent of the will. This meant that if necessary, one partner could be drugged in order for sexual intercourse to take place to seal the marriage contract. Now, I don't claim expertise in this and I stand to be corrected, but I'm not sure that a woman could consummate a marriage with a drugged and unconscious man.
No.
So, what this is actually saying is that a marriage is validly consummated even if the man has to knock his wife out to have sex with her. And this is to do with an ambiguity in what constitutes a marriage, which has never been fully resolved. Because on the one hand, there is the marriage ceremony, there's the vows to each other. On the other hand, there's the sexual consummation of the marriage. And both of those have to be true in order for the marriage to be valid. But there are open questions as to, there's obviously intended to be a delay between the ceremony and the consummation, although in most modern marriages, those come the other way round. I remember my mother had a very good Italian friend when we lived in Zambia when I was a child, and Berto used to come and confide to my mother, and he got himself. We weren't Catholics as children. My mum was Presbyterian, but that didn't stop her being the agony aunt to Catholic Berto. And Berto came in one day and said to her, "I have made a terrible mistake in marrying this woman." And she said, "Well, Berto, I think, has the marriage been consummated?" He said, "Please, can you write to the Pope and tell him it was consumed but not enjoyed?" So, but enjoyment didn't matter much. But with Vatican II, the language used to describe marriage changed from that of contract to that of covenant, evoking the love of God for Israel in the Old Testament and the love of Christ for the Church in the New Testament. So marriage becomes much more associated with relationality, with a dynamic and ongoing commitment to love, fidelity, and care. And you'll remember that last week, those of you who were here, I pointed out that the word azer, which is used to describe the creation of the woman in Genesis, and which is usually translated as handmaid, with the suggestion of subjugation and subordination, that word azer most commonly occurs in the Hebrew Bible in relation to God. God is azer to Israel far more often than that word occurs. I think it only occurs twice in relation to the creation story, and the rest of the time it's mostly about God, the way God cares for Israel is the way this Azer is created for Adam. So sacramentality and nuptial ecclesiology. Actually, before I do that, I am just going to say a little bit about theology of the body and complementarity. As the feminist movement became more vocal and challenging in the 1960s and 70s, the Catholic Church began to revisit its doctrine of sexual difference as hierarchical. Really, the Catholic understanding of sexual difference was that the woman was a rather inferior model of the same human, and the reason men had to be priests was Christ was a man, but the male body was the more perfect version of the human body, but both were essentially the same. So if you like, the woman was the family car and the man was a Lamborghini. But there came a point in the 20th century when this hierarchical understanding of the sexes as being the same but unequal, hierarchical, changed to the sexes being equal but different. So if you read back through, and I was going to share some essays I've written for those of you who want references for all this, but Hans Urs von Balthasar was a sort of influential Swiss theologian of the mid-20th century, and a lot of his teaching has subtly fed into papal teaching on marriage since. And he saw the challenges of feminism as potentially very destructive to the church, but the church also recognized that it had to provide a response that did not uphold women as inferior or subordinate to men. And Pope John Paul II, in his catechesis on the book of Genesis, came up with the idea of complementarity. It had been mentioned before, but he really developed this, and it's since become theology of the body. So the sexes are equal but different. But when we peel back what that means, we see that nothing has changed. It really does remain a theology of male authority and female nurture and care. So rather than being subordinate, women now have a special vocation to care. Pope Francis uses the term feminine genius. And there are all sorts of problems with that if we think about it, because if, as I shall show you later when we look at Mulieris Dignitatem, Pope John Paul II's apostolic letter on the dignity of women, if all Christians are in some sense woman in relation to God, which Pope Francis insists the church is a woman, the ecclesiology that we can trace way back to medieval philosophy sees creation as feminized in relation to God, but then surely any characteristics that are associated with women, like nurture, like care, like feminine genius, whatever that is, are the vocations of Christians. We should all be nurturing, caring, looking after the vulnerable and the weak. So this kind of attempt to maintain some kind of difference between the essential characteristics of the sexes runs into difficulty. It is also an innovation in Catholic understanding of sexual difference, which, as I say, until the mid-20th century was always hierarchical, but it wasn't an essential difference. Now, with the rise of a theology of equal but different, we come very close to an ontology of sexual difference. We come close to the claim that in the very essence of our being, male and female are not the same. Pope John Paul II spoke of two incarnations, two ways of being a body. If that's true, how can he say anything about women at all? If we have that much of a duality, we surely then have to have women speaking for women and men speaking for men. But we wouldn't get very far with that either. What we have in the 20th century is the introduction of sexual essentialism, an essential difference between the sexes. And that is largely due, as I say, to the influence of Hans Urs von Balthasar and to a certain sort of romanticism in modern European thought. It's not Catholic tradition. So we're playing with some fairly new concepts that seek to keep the relationship between the sexes in place, but drape it in a language that appears more egalitarian than the old hierarchies. Okay, so I want to talk for a bit now about nuptial ecclesiology and sacramentality. When two baptized people are married, the marriage is sacramental. And we'll remember that baptism is not just Catholic baptism. Any baptism in the Trinity is recognized by the Catholic Church as valid. Interestingly enough, my husband is not baptized. We've been married for 50 years this year, but ours is not a sacramental marriage. It's a natural law marriage because he's not baptized. But if we look at the basis for some of this nuptial ecclesiology, where the relationship between husband and wife is sacramentally reflective of the relationship between Christ and the church, or at least analogous to that. It goes way back to some of the language of the relationship between God and Israel in the Old Testament, and it continues into passages like Ephesians, where Paul discusses the relationship between husbands and wives, including the claim that wives should submit to their husbands as the church submits to Christ. But he begins this discourse on marriage by saying, give way to one another in obedience to Christ. And then he goes into this complex discussion on marriage. But finally he says, this mystery has many implications, but I'm saying it applies to Christ and the church. To sum up, you two, each one of you, must love his wife as he loves himself, and let every wife respect her husband. Now, if we look at that from a modern liberal egalitarian perspective, we can see problems with it. We can see perhaps a lack of mutuality. We can raise questions. But if we look back to what that teaching on marriage meant in the first century, it was radical, and it was radically good for women. Some of you may know the historian Tom Holland, who has been writing some really interesting revisionist histories of the early church and Christian influence on Western society. His book Dominion has had a particularly good reception. And I think he's part of a broader movement today among some thinkers who are looking again at the way in which in Britain in particular, actually, I think, Ireland has a different set of problems to grapple with. But in Britain, certainly in England, the division between secular and religious there's a rupture there. And there's been a great deal of hostility to religion among secular thinkers. But I see that gap gradually closing over. And Tom Holland would be one example. So writing about the history of the early church, he writes that the insistence of Scripture that a man and a woman, whenever they took to the marital bed, were joined as Christ and his church were joined, becoming one flesh, gave to both a rare dignity. If the wife was instructed to submit to her husband, then so equally was the husband instructed to be faithful to his wife. Here, by the standards of the age into which Christianity had been born, was an obligation that demanded an almost heroic degree of self-denial. The Roman law, unlike the Talmud and unlike the customs of most other ancient peoples, defined marriage as a monogamous institution. That Roman law defined marriage as a monogamous institution had not for a moment meant that it required men to display lifelong fidelity. Husbands had enjoyed a legal right to divorce and, of course, forcing themselves on their inferiors pretty much as they pleased. This was why, in its long and arduous struggle to trammel the sexual appetites of Christians, the Church had made marriage the particular focus of its attentions. The double standards that for so long had been a feature of marital ethics had come to be sternly patrolled. Joined together under the watchful eye of Christ, under the watchful eye of Christ, men were commanded to be as faithful to their wives as their wives were to them. Divorce, except in the very rarest of circumstances, was prohibited. To cast off a wife was to render her an adulteress. So Jesus himself had declared, the bonds of a Christian marriage, mutual and indissoluble as they were, served to join man and woman together as they had never been joined before. So that suggests that the Christian understanding of marriage in the ancient world was a radical innovation. And Tom Holland argues that in introducing the idea of freedom into marriage, in breaking arranged marriages, in breaking kinship groups, Christian marriage transformed Western civilization as no other institution did. Now, of course, we know that customs of arranged marriages and everything else have always crept back into the scene, but doctrinally, the Christian understanding of marriage has always been and still is based on the free consent of both couples knowing what they're doing when they commit to marriage. And of course, the marriage, the liturgy of marriage, the church performance, if you like, of the marriage ceremony is a relatively modern innovation, because it used to just be that couples would pledge their troth, they would start a sexual relationship. Next time the priest came around, he might bless the wedding. And even today, the marriage ceremony, the couple actually perform the sacrament for each other. The priest is only the witness. The priest does not perform the sacrament. It's the one occasion in the Catholic Church when a female body must be present for the sacrament to happen. And that's the only good argument I can see against same-sex marriage. But I'll come back to that. But I also, reflecting on, well, what would make a sacramental marriage? I want to suggest that perhaps we need to say that the sacrament begins when the couple make their lifelong pledge to each other, but it ends at the funeral of one or the other of them, because we know that many marriages break down along the way. And it's quite hard. I mean, the church has revised its teaching so that if a marriage is actually annulled, if a marriage is declared there never was a marriage, then that marriage was never valid. And any children born of the marriage, though, are not illegitimate. The church has kind of brought that in. But there are valid marriages that break down, and that's very painful for the one, if one spouse thinks this was a marriage and the other spouse wants out of it. So I wonder if we could see sacramental marriage as a process that those of us who are married commit to life, and some people manage to carry that through, others don't. But the sacrament, just as a priest begins the words of consecration, at a certain point, if the priest had a heart attack or something, you go back to the beginning of the consecration in order to start again, to make sure that the consecration is valid. So maybe we need to see sacramental marriage as a witness through time to the unfailing, faithful love that Christ's love for the church is to some extent seen in the couple who manage to get through the hurdles and struggles and challenges of marriage, which is no condemnation of those who don't. But also, I think our sacramental understanding needs, it's one occasion where I think transcendence must take place over immanence. We mustn't put the full burden of Christ's love for the church onto every ordinary clay-footed married couple. Rather, we must say that there is a promise of a love that is expressed in marriage, is expressed in parental metaphors, is expressed in metaphors of erotic love in Song of Songs, in the love of friendship. Jesus calls his disciples friends. We can say that there is the kind of love we all yearn for in life, a perfect, fulfilling, all-satisfying love, which is Christ's love of the church, which is God's love for us. No marriage comes close to that, and any marriage that tried to be like that would implode, because neither partner can meet that all needy, all consuming demand for totality. So we have a vision of love, and all of us muddling along to live our love in our muddled clay-footed lives has that vision and that promise, but we meet that ideal imperfectly. So I'm suggesting that a theology of marriage is one case where I think theology being top down rather than bottom up gives a certain freedom to fail for married couples doing their best and sometimes not succeeding. But I want to talk now about how essential heterosexuality is to marriage. And I have a letter. Both people, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor has died, and so has the barrister who passed this letter to me, who was in correspondence with the Cardinal about the Church's ban on contraception, which, by the way, still applies. Pope Francis has been pastorally sensitive in the way he's spoken about that, but artificial birth control is still the rule for Catholic couples, even although the vast majority don't observe it. But Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor wrote to this friend of mine saying, "It seems to me that the link in intercourse between unity of the couple and procreation is extremely important. If you divorce it completely, then there is no reason why homosexual relations might not be permitted in certain circumstances because of the unitive aspect of the relationship." So what he's saying there is admitting that if procreation becomes secondary to the unitive aspect of the relationship, what's to stop same-sex marriage? Now, thinking about this, the Church does marry postmenopausal women. It does marry heterosexual couples who are knowingly infertile. So the argument against same-sex marriage begins to break down if that's one of the criteria that the marriage must be procreative. But pushing that a bit further, I want to suggest that the Catholic Church has a real store of wisdom in its reconciling of natural law and scripture, in its reconciling of grace and nature. And it's always had an understanding that there's a distinction between sacramental marriage between baptized Christians and civil marriage, which according to the natural law is a good. It's not a sacrament, but it's a good ordained for the good of the couple, the children, the family, society. And I want to suggest there also the long tradition in the Catholic Church that the law should not be used to police morals. It should be used only to preserve the good of society. So even if what I'm doing is regarded as immoral according to church teaching, it shouldn't be illegal unless there's a really compelling reason that shows that it is harmful to society, not just to me, but to others. Now, when we think about that, we might say, well, in some ways, everything I do affects others, and that's true, but it's a helpful distinction. And I think when we talk about sexuality, we need to say, what is the Christian ideal of how love is expressed with our bodies, with our hearts, with our lives. What does it mean to say, I give myself to you until death? For two people to say that. And I think that is something that as Christians we should celebrate and affirm in every way we can. So when a same-sex Christian couple want to enter into that sacrament of marriage, surely that is the highest possible affirmation of the value of married love for Christians and should be welcomed rather than banned. But then I also think living as we do in an age of proliferating sexual liberalisation, much of which is indeed deeply damaging and harmful, we need to bring into play that idea that there are lots of things people do that are not moral, but they shouldn't be illegal. So promiscuity, relationships between heterosexual couples, same-sex couples, whatever we're talking about, we need to allow for a very wide sphere of tolerance of the ways in which people sexually express themselves, but say this is the way that Christianity understands the way sex is an expression of lifelong love between two people. And at the point at which we're ready to do that as confessing Christians, I can't see that there should be any other argument against it, but others might want to come in and argue with that. I also have to say, as a woman, as a mother of 4 children who did practice contraception, I really resent the idea that Catholic women are condemned to having many more children than they can cope with or want, that often wreak havoc with their sex lives, as many Irish Catholic families will tell us, in many different ways, just to keep homosexual marriage out of the church. I mean, no, sorry, that is not a good enough reason to defend the church's ban on contraception. And I'm not saying contraception is always a wonderful thing for the world. Again, we need to be able to bring a wise and discerning approach towards when this is good, when it's perhaps creating worlds of sexual liberation that are not very liberating, especially for women. But also in that letter from the Cardinal, he says, it may be noted that much of what Pope Paul VI said in Humanae Vitae has turned out to be true, namely developing a more casual use of sex, a diminishment of respect for women, and an increase in abortion. Those are all very dodgy claims that can be argued from many different perspectives. It wasn't just contraception that led to some of the sexual challenges and messes that our Western cultures are in today, or indeed the world's cultures. And again, as a married woman for whom, you know, I didn't want more than 4 children. And to suggest that a marriage is diminished by a loving couple deciding responsibly to decide on how many children they are able to love and nurture and educate and bring to maturity, I think there's a problem with suggesting that, look, we said contraception was harmful, and it is. It ignores the experience of many mature, loving people to the contrary. So that is the cardinal. So I'm suggesting that when we talk about sexuality and marriage, we need to be able to hold in tension the freedoms that any society must allow its people, even if we think some of that is immoral, but we must still be able to understand why the Christian attitude towards sexuality has a particular role in terms of lifelong commitment and fidelity. And today, that old teaching that Tom Holland says was good for women, I think it is good for women. I know many women today who would love to have a loving, responsible, faithful husband. And they can be few and far between. We live in an age of muddle and confusion, and I think women particularly, and girls, have paid a very high price for the sexual revolution. So I do think there's an opportunity for us to revisit our theology of marriage and to to be liberal about sexuality. People experiment with sexuality, people get things wrong. It's not the end of the world. The church used to have a much higher theology of different kinds of sin. Pride was the first sin that the medieval church saw as dangerous, not sex. Sex has always been in there. But I think we need to reflect on how we can welcome people searching for love into a deeper understanding of the potential of married Christian love for heterosexual and same-sex couples, but with a realistic acceptance of the messy realities of life, which Pope Francis keeps calling us to. But sometimes, as I say, marriage fails. And we know that the Catholic Church does not recognise divorce. The indissolubility of marriage applies, as I said, to a baptized man and woman who freely consented and the marriage has been consummated. But from the beginning, the Catholic Church has allowed for the dissolution of marriage under certain circumstances. The Pauline privilege refers to Paul's suggestion in 1 Corinthians that a believer can leave a non-believer under certain circumstances because God has called you to a life of peace. So if your spouse is preventing you from living your faith, so for example, in the past when you had to promise to bring your children up as Catholic, if your spouse is preventing you from living your faith, you can get a divorce on those grounds. And there's also the Petrine privilege, which refers to the papal right to dissolve a marriage between a baptized and a non-baptized person in order to allow for remarriage between two baptized believers. So bad news for my husband if at the age of 70 and after 50 years of marriage I fall head over heels in love with a baptized Catholic. It's just possible. I've got a get out clause. Okay. Now, one of the challenges we're facing today, which I don't want to go into because it's a minefield, but when we talk about sexuality, we also are aware of proliferating gender identities, proliferating ideas of what it means to be a man or a woman. And I think there are really serious social challenges around this. And I'm not arguing one way or the other here. But I do want to say that here again, we run into a problem with the essentialism that now informs the Catholic understanding of the difference between the sexes. Men are men and women are women. And there's no crossover between them. There's no fluidity. Von Balthasar says, right down to every cell in my body, my whole psychic makeup is feminine. And if you're a man, yours is masculine. We all know that we move in and out of gendered roles. If I'm in a board meeting, I act differently. I will act as men act in board meetings. When my husband's with the grandchildren, as we are this week, he's not macho. He's not macho with me either, but his role is to care for the children. It shouldn't matter whether I'm caring for them or he's caring for them. Their needs are the same and our responsibilities are the same. So there's lots of fluidity between the roles we play. But if I go to Pope John Paul II's apostolic letter Mulieris Dignitatem, and I'm not giving you the whole thing here because I want to allow time for discussion, but I count 5 genders in Mulieris Dignitatem, and all this I would give you quotes for if you wanted them, but I can send you an article I've written. So 1, there's the female human, woman, virgin, bride, mother, who is a biological female. And 2, there's the male human, which is the man, the bridegroom, the father. 3, there's the church, which is female and male bodies as woman, virgin, bride, mother. 4, there's the bridegroom, which is female and male bodies who love as Christ loves. And then 5, there's the bridegroom who's the male body as priest. So the priest, sexual essentialism kicks in. It has to be a man. Every other gendered role, men and women both play. So when we address this hugely complex challenge of gendered identities, what the Vatican calls gender ideology, we need to be aware that our own ecclesiology needs the language of gender fluidity to make sense. Medieval mystic men and women spoke to Christ as the bridegroom of their soul as the bride. Now, there's some suggestion that for people like St. John of the Cross, it was a way of denying their own homosexuality. I don't like that kind of projection because, it seems to me reading too much into the past. But certainly when male mystics say to Christ, "Kiss me on the lips," the way they speak in the language of the Bride of Song of Songs, that's gender fluidity. So I'm not going to go into lots of that. We can discuss it if you want to, but I just want to suggest that a lot of what we're grappling with today about what is a man, what is a woman, what are our characteristics, what are our differences, the church's language of gender is poetic and has to be poetic. Otherwise, we can't speak about ecclesiology, we can't speak about mysticism, we can't use a lot of what our tradition has used from the beginning to speak of the relationship between God and creation. So that's a challenge for us. Um, I don't know that I want to say much else at the moment. I want to appeal for a deeper understanding of the goods of Christian marriage, a more compassionate approach to the challenges of marriage and why it often breaks down, and why indeed there are abusive marriages. Usually the woman is the victim, not always, but when the abused partner has a duty of self-respect and dignity to oneself to get out of that relationship. I would also suggest that living as we do, when we live for much longer than any previous generations in Western society, Donald Trump might change all that soon, but for the time being, most of us, as I say, I'm celebrating my golden wedding this year. That is a 20th century um, event because people didn't used to live long enough to be married that long. They never had to ask what it means to be with this guy 50 years later when you met him when you were 20. They had serial monogamy. Death was much more frequent. And women died in childbirth, men died in battles, everyone died of diseases. So serial monogamy was always a more common pattern of marriage than what we have today, which is the lifelong marriage of one person to another. And I want to suggest that in that situation, it's not surprising that we have blended families, that marriages do break down and people do remarry. And when they navigate that well, they make new forms of the extended kinship group. Step parents, step grandparents, step children can flourish. And we all know families where they do, and we all know families where it fails catastrophically. But for the church to say to people who are at their most wounded and fragile, when their marriages have broken down, to say you are no longer in communion with us. If you've met someone else you love and you want to form a healthy, loving family out of the breakdown of your old life, what does it say about the church's compassion to the children and the wounded spouses that you're out of communion? So I think there's an appeal for retaining, as I say, a transcendent vision of the good of marriage and accepting that as messy human beings, we muddle along doing our best and sometimes get it wrong. And sexuality is a very powerful drive. I'm currently just reviewing a book for the Irish Theological Quarterly, actually, on called Desirable Belief, which is about the power of eros and how irresistible it is. And I'm reading this author and thinking, I'll have what she's having if that's the way she experiences it. Anyway, there we are. Lots to think about. But that's all I'll say for tonight.